Are you curious about flying tailwheel airplanes? Well, I was too. And I met with Doug Rozendaal from Mason City, Iowa, who gave me a really nice introduction, which we're sharing with you in this video.
All right, so Martin, you've expressed some interest in some tailwheel flying. I know you've done a little bit of tailwheel flying in the past, and I know you're a glider pilot, which is, most gliders are kind of tailwheel airplanes, but a little bit different, but a lot of the concepts are the same. And you know, what I see in the pilot community today is a continuous erosion of basic stick and rudder skills. And I think that tailwheel airplanes have a lot to teach people, not just about flying tailwheels, but about flying all airplanes.
Right.
And about bringing back to the forefront some of those basic skills. You know, a lot of our accidents are landing accidents, and most of those harken back to a failure of the, you know, basic stick and rudder skills that I learned when I started flying tailwheel airplanes. I didn't start in tailwheel airplanes. I tell people I got my certificate in a 150, but I learned to fly in a Twin Beach. And the tailwheels airplanes, I mean, they discriminate technique so well, and so I think you know, it's good that we share some of this with people and maybe inspire some people to go out and get some tailwheel instruction and just lay a foundation here with some of the basics. So that's what I thought we'd talk about today.
Right. Yeah.
All right. So the first question I would have is, why does a tail dragger sit on the tail?
Because the center of gravity is behind the main wheels.
That's right. It's that simple. And so that brings a whole bunch of dynamics into the equation. I equate landing a tailwheel airplane like backing a boat trailer down the runway at 50 miles an hour. Because the center of gravity wants to be in front of the point of contact. All right, so this whole center of gravity behind the wheels thing is a function, it has a lot of impact on a lot of aspects of tailwheel flying. So here's our center of gravity, it's behind the wheels, okay? If the center of gravity is behind the wheels, we're pushing the airplane down the runway, right?
Yeah, the airplane's inertia is pushing it.
That's right, and the friction is coming at these 2 points here.
That's right.
Okay? This center of gravity would like to be pulling the airplane down the runway. And so there is an inherent, if you're perfectly straight, there's no yaw.
Everything is
tendency.
symmetric, yeah.
But the minute that the airplane cocks, okay, this force goes this direction, and that tends to accelerate the airplane in yaw. So the airplane is dynamically unstable in yaw as it rolls down the runway, and it's incumbent upon the pilot using the rudder and the ailerons to keep the airplane tracking straight down the runway.
Right.
If we allow this yaw to begin, and the airplane starts yawing, this vector is going to move this way, and when this vector moves outside of that tire, the airplane's going to go around, and there is nothing in the world you can do to stop it, and that's called a ground loop. So the fact that the center of gravity of our airplane is behind the main wheels has a huge impact on why tailwheel airplanes are more demanding and require more finesse to fly than a trike.
Yep.
When that center of gravity crosses the line of direction of the tire, okay, now it's out here, and we push on this brake to try to get the airplane back, and in fact, that's going to cause the airplane to go even further. So one of the secrets to flying a tailwheel airplane and keeping it going down the runway is to never let it get out of center. Keep it in the center at all cost. Because the farther out of center you go, the harder it's going to be to correct. And the greater the likelihood is that you'll overcorrect. And when you overcorrect and go the other direction, it's usually that's the one that gets you. The airplane goes one way and the correction's made, and the airplane goes the other way and then overcorrects. And then around we go, and we call that a
ground loop.
It's a ground loop. And you know, the joke in tailwheel airplanes are those who have and those who will. And you know, I'm not ashamed to say that I've ground looped several airplanes. I'm also proud to say it's always been in training. I was giving training, and you've got to let things in the training environment. You've got to let things go to some level and see that the student can recover. And I'm also happy to say that I've never scratched an airplane in a ground loop, but I've been around a lot of times. So that's one dynamic that's different in a tailwheel, is the center of gravity wants to be ahead of the wheels. All right?
Okay.
So the next dynamic in a tailwheel airplane is, here's our wheels, here's our airplane, yeah, and here's our center of gravity, right? Mm-hmm. So when we come in to land, we're descending, right?
Right.
Okay. And if we're descending, so we have downward energy, and we don't arrest all of that energy like sometimes we know happens, and the tires hit the ground, okay, the main wheels hit the ground, what's going to happen to the pitch of the airplane when the center of gravity has this downward inertia?
Well, the way you drew it, the tail is going to go down further when the main's already on the ground, so our pitch angle goes up.
And then what happens?
Then we have a higher angle of attack and create more lift and bounce off.
And we fly, okay? And so that's called a bounce, all right? And that would be in a wheel landing configuration or a 2-point landing configuration, because we're landing fast enough that the tail wheel is above the runway. And then normally in a well-designed tailwheel airplane, the airplane sits on the ground at the stall attitude or very close to the stall attitude. So the other type of landing that we make in a tailwheel airplane is called a 3-point landing. And that implies that either all 3 tires hit simultaneously, or even better yet, the tail wheel hits first. So if we pitch the airplane up and the tail wheel hits first, then what happens as the center of gravity of the airplane comes down?
Then the pitch is reduced and we have a little less lift.
That's right, and then it's all done, okay? And so those are the 2 types of landings. There are, it's kind of like single versus twin and all those other discussions. But a master, some people are absolutely 3-point all the time. Some people are absolutely wheel land all the time. In my view, the master of the airplane is competent in both. There are some exceptions to that rule. Some airplanes are not well suited to one or the other. For instance, the DC-3 can be 3-pointed, but if you happen to screw that landing up, you could break the airplane. So most people don't 3-point a DC-3 or a late model Twin Beach, okay? We wheel land those airplanes all the time. There are some people that say the pits should never be wheel landed. It should be 3-pointed all the time. And there may be some merit in that. One thing about the 3-point is airplanes were designed to fly, not to drive. And so my philosophy is we should always start flying at the minimum possible speed and stop flying at the minimum possible speed. You have less energy, you have less problems. And so that leans towards the 3-point situation, but there are times when it's windy or something like that where you might need to use a 3-point, or a wheel landing is a better choice. But again, the master of a tailwheel airplane is competent in both. So now we understand why this center of gravity thing is so important. As the center of gravity moves aft, what happens to controllability?
Controllability is increased. Stability goes down.
Stability is decreased, okay? So that means that controllability means that a small control input is going to yield a greater, okay? So we need to think about, okay, if I'm gonna make a wheel landing and I've got a seriously aft CG, okay, this CG downforce has got more, and so I'm gonna have to touch that airplane down on the wheels with absolutely zero.
Right.
Zero downward inertia. And then in the wheel landing situation, after we do touch down on the tires, we do what's called pin the airplane. And it depends, but it should be a very subtle relaxation of the back pressure just to raise the tail ever so slightly. and kill the lift so that the airplane will sit on the wheels. We're in a 3-point attitude. When the mains hit, or better yet, the tail wheel hits, the airplane falls down, and then we just bring the stick all the way back into our belly to hold the airplane on the ground. So those are the dynamics of the two different types of landings in tailwheel airplanes. And there's a time and a place for both. And again, some airplanes are suited to one or the other better than the other. And so all of those factor in to our decision. But the airplane that we're going to be flying, the Tailorcraft L2, is well suited to wheel landings or 3-point landings, and it demonstrates them very well. The airplane sets in the stall attitude. You'll hit tail first. Just if you're at absolute minimum speed, you'll hit tail first with no power, and the mains will be just a few inches in the ground, and they'll hit the runway. They'll fall onto the runway smoothly, and it's all done. The whole thing's over, and then all you have to do is kick a little rudder. So most landing accidents occur because the airplane was landed too fast. All right, and flying a tailwheel, as we master the 3-point, we're going to learn how to fly that airplane to the ground in the absolute stalled configuration. And sadly, if you go to the airport and spend an afternoon watching people take off and land, that's not how people are landing light general aviation airplanes today. They're driving them into the ground. And consequently, we see this higher than desirable landing accident rate. And that's what I think some tailwheel flying would do to help the general GA population, is learn how to fly the airplane and land the airplane at minimum speed. The other thing that we see problems with in GA is crosswinds. I see crosswind landing skills continuing to deteriorate as airplanes become simpler and all of this. And so, but there's still reward in an elegant crosswind landing. And it is the safest way to do it. And so I really think we need to focus, and the tailwheel airplane has the ability to teach us how to make a proper crosswind landing, because if you don't make a proper crosswind landing in a tailwheel airplane, you're going to go for a ride. You're going to end up out in the farming somewhere. So the first thing that people say when we ask low-time students about how you keep the airplane going straight down the runway, what's the normal answer?
Crab angle.
Okay, that we crab on final,
Yeah.
And then what happens?
Then we transition to a slip.
That's right.
Lower the wing.
And then we come in and land.
And
And so when we're in that slip configuration, we've got one wing down and opposite rudder, and the airplane is tracking. So here's the way I teach that, is come around the base to final turn and line up on the center of the runway. And in training, we're going to do this very early, so we've got time to experiment and play with the cross control to find out what it takes to resolve the crosswind component. And so how I teach people is to isolate these controls. Once you make the transition to the slip, your nose, the nose of the airplane, or offset to your side if it's a side-by-side airplane, and the far end of the runway. So we're going to line up those 3 points. Your nose, the nose of the airplane, and the far end of the runway. You're going to line up those 3 points with the rudder, right? And keep the longitudinal axis of the airplane pointed at the far end of the runway.
Okay.
And then we're going to use the ailerons to move the airplane left and right to get and keep it over the extended center line.
Okay.
All right. People do okay at that. Some of them do. They do okay at that. And they fly down, and in tricycle gear airplanes, some of them make very plausible touchdowns, and the airplane may or may not be fairly well aligned with the center line, or the longitudinal axis of the airplane aligned with the center line of the runway. Maybe it's off or left or right, but people do okay at that. In a tricycle gear airplane, typically when the airplane hits the ground, the flying's over, right? I mean, you just sit back, relax, and roll out.
Yeah.
In a tailwheel airplane, the flying begins when the tires touch the ground. So we have to resolve this vertical descent. If we're making a wheel landing, we've got to kill that angle of attack as the tires touch the ground. And in a crosswind, we're going to hit on the upwind tire first because we're in this slip, and ease the stick forward, release the back pressure. That will allow the downwind tire to impact the runway. Okay, and now we're rolling on 2 tires, we're going down, and people are, just keep the airplane going straight with the rudder. Now in a tricycle gear airplane, in a 172, when you push the rudder, let's say we've got a right crosswind and you come down in a 172 and you touch down on the upwind tire, and the airplane wants to weathercock into the right crosswind, and you're pushing left rudder to counteract that. Okay, so that deflects the rudder this way. What else does pushing on that rudder in a Cessna 172 or in your Bonanza, what else does that do?
It moves the nose wheel to the left.
That's correct. And so now when the nose wheel comes down, where's it pointed?
Left.
That's right. And have you ever felt that kind of unhappiness there as you're rolling out after the, okay? And that's because the nose wheel wants to take the airplane this way. The wind wants to take it this way.
Right.
And you would really like to have the nose wheel going straight down the runway. And that's one case where Cirrus might be onto something because they're nose wheel casters and it comes straight back. All right? We're not fighting with that nose wheel. And sadly, if you read the crosswind landing section in the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, you'll find no mention of ailerons in the book, the Pilot Flying Handbook. No mention of ailerons in the crosswind landing discussion. So when we deflect the aileron, when we're coming down the runway, on the runway, and we deflect the aileron into the wind, what are we doing with the aileron? So we got a right crosswind in this situation, we put in right stick. What's happening with the ailerons?
So on the right side, the aileron moves up. On the left side, it moves down.
Okay. So what are we doing to the down aileron on that downwind side? When we put that down, what are we creating?
We're creating more lift and more drag.
That's right. We're creating lift, which induces drag, but we're also creating parasite drag, right? Okay, conversely, on the upwind aileron, that aileron's up. And so the airplane sits in the ground with a little bit of angle of attack, and that aileron's actually hiding behind the wing, and there's separated airflow there. And so we're reducing drag on the upwind wind, we're increasing drag on the downwind wing. And if we got an airplane with a 40-some foot wingspan, that's on a 20-foot lever. And that's pulling that airplane around. And this is the biggest thing I see is people, especially in Cherokees and Cirruses, they come in, they may do a fairly good job of lining the airplane up at touchdown, and the moment the airplane touches down on the upwind wheel, they neutralize the ailerons, they let the downwind wing impact the ground, and the airplane instantly wants to turn into the wind, and they're fighting that with the rudders. And that works in a light crosswind, but in a heavy crosswind, it doesn't work. We've got to have that adverse yaw in there, which is dragging that downwind wing back. And once all of those elements come together and you master crosswind landings in a tailwheel airplane, you will never again can be even slightly concerned about crosswinds in your Bonanza up to, and quite frankly, far in excess of the demonstrated crosswind component of the airplane, because it's capable of landing in much, much higher crosswinds than the demonstrated. I mean, the lawyers wrote that, not the airframe, not the engineers.
Right, yeah.
I'm sure you've landed your Bonanza at or above the demonstrated crosswind component, and it with no problem whatsoever.
That's right.
It is very capable. It's, we just put this number and say, here's what we promise that this airplane's capable of with a quote-unquote average pilot.
The one question I had when you talked about how the center of gravity wants to push forward, if you find yourself, for whatever reason, losing control, fighting the airplane more than you're comfortable with, would it help to add power and add a force in the front of the airplane to straighten it out? Or?
Yes, I mean, if you're losing control of the airplane and it's not gone yet, adding power and just going around or climbing back up to 5 feet, stabilizing and landing again. Because yes, first of all, it increases the authority, it increases the airplane wants to, but mostly you just, get it away from the ground and sort it out again. That would be Another thing that we need to talk about in tailwheel airplanes is left turning tendencies, okay?
Okay.
Airplanes want to turn to the left. Why is that?
There are multiple contributors for that. You know, the famous P factor, where the propeller blades have, take a different bite on the up versus the down. There is gyroscopic precession.
When would gyroscopic precession be most pronounced in a tailwheel airplane?
When I change the pitch attitude, so when I raise the tail on the takeoff, roll it against speed, and when I lower it for liftoff.
That's right. So let's set the tail on the ground. The airplane's back here, right? Okay, and so we're on the runway, we're adding power. I'm gonna add power, and that's by spinning the wheel. Okay, and this is the descending blade, correct? The airplane turns this way. And once we get the power up, then I want you to raise the tail. Okay, you ready? Nope.
Yep.
So here we go. There's the power. Now raise the tail.
Oh, it goes left.
Can you stop it from going left? Now put the tail down. It goes right.
It's very hard to
You
counter.
cannot do it.
No.
It's going to turn.
Yeah, it goes left when I move the tail up, and right when I move the tail down.
That's right. And it's strong force, isn't it? I mean, you can't underestimate that force. So now imagine that propeller, which weighs several hundred pounds, turning at, 1,800 RPMs at takeoff. All right, so we said the airplane sits on the ground very close to its stall attitude, right?
Right.
So what's the typical stall angle of attack of a GA airfoil?
Between 15 and 20 degrees.
Yep. And so if the airplane is sitting on the ground at 15 to 20 degrees and the descending blade of the propeller, that means there's 30 degrees of pitch difference between the ascending and descending blade.
Right.
And so here in a minute, we're going to get a protractor and we're going to go look at the difference between those props on the ground. And you'll see a very dramatic representation of P factor.
So this is the right side on the propeller tip.
Yeah,
almost
descending.
20 degrees.
And this is, see, it's minus. So this is vertical, see?
Yeah.
That's 0. So that's -5. So the difference is 20 degrees between the ascending and the descending blade. And this propeller tip is actually pushing forward a little bit. So that's why all the work is being done out here. Now, as you raise the tail, the center of thrust moves to the center of the propeller, because if the crankshaft is parallel with the relative wind, then there is no P factor. When the airplane's in the 3-point attitude, the tail's down, the nose is up, and we talked about P factor, so we're going to have a much higher angle of attack on this descending blade than this ascending blade.
Right.
So the center of thrust is going to be over here somewhere. All right, so if this is the center of thrust and it's over here, what's that airplane going to want to do?
It wants to yaw to the left
That's correct. And how are we going to counteract that?
with right rudder.
And
Left aileron.
drag over here.
Yeah.
So we want lift going this direction from the rudder, drag going this direction from the aileron to offset this offset in thrust, plus the slipstream effect, which is pushing this way. And as we raise the tail, if we raise the tail, do we have to raise the tail?
We could just wait till it flies away.
That's right. We could take off in a 3-point attitude. In some cases, that's a better choice. Other cases, if it's gusty or something like that, we might want to get the tail up and get a little more speed so that we don't find ourselves 4 feet in the air with no airspeed, and then a gust, we lose the gust and the airplane falls out of the sky. So we talked about P factor, we talked about gyroscopic effect. Are there any other left turning tendencies that?
Yeah, there's torque and slipstream are the other two.
Okay. Would they be any different in a tailwheel airplane than in a?
Should work the same way.
They should work the same way. So thinking about all the factors that cause the airplane to want to go to the left on takeoff, as we make the crosswind decision, we've got a 90-degree crosswind.
Mm-hmm.
So the wind's 270 at 15, and we've got a 1836 runway. Which runway are we going to choose for takeoff?
I want to counter the left turning tendency. So if I have the wind from the right, it'll push my rudder so that the nose goes to the right, and that offsets a little bit the left turning tendencies.
And one of the big stories about the P-51 Mustang is the torque on takeoff, right? And on those occasional days when you have a 15-degree direct crosswind, you can taxi out in a Mustang and almost put your feet on the floor and add power, and the airplane will go absolutely straight as a string, because about 5 degrees of rudder trim and about a 15 knot crosswind counteracts all the left turning tendencies. So in the Mustang, we always choose a right crosswind for takeoff, whenever possible, or when given that choice, even maybe just favoring a little bit of a quartering tailwind, because your feet will be just dead center, and you'll just a little bit of tap and the airplane goes straight as a string. And that's true in all airplanes, but it's especially true because of the additional P factor that's caused by the fact that the tail's sitting at that 15 degrees angle in a tail dragger. Conversely, on landing, which now we don't have torque, we don't have P factor, but what do we have?
Well, we still change our pitch, so
That's right.
Gyroscopic precession is still a factor.
So a right all things being equal, we want a right crosswind for takeoff and a left crosswind for landing if we're going to make a wheel landing. That would be another thing in favor of a 3-point landing, right? There's no change in pitch as we land,
Right.
and we're at minimum speed. So all of these are things that a competent tailwheel pilot puts into the equation to make a decision. And again, those skills that you learn from mastering this kind of an airplane, well, I've been flying tailwheels for 40 years and I haven't mastered them yet, but from flying tailwheel airplanes regularly will serve you well in your Bonanza, in a Cirrus, in any airplane. So that's the basics of the tailwheel experience. It is stick and rudder flying. It is flying at landing at absolute minimum controllable airspeed. It's arriving at the runway with zero or at or near zero downward inertia. It is keeping the ailerons involved in the crosswind landing. And when you put all those pieces together, you find yourself an elegant tailwheel pilot. And when you take an elegant tailwheel pilot and put them in a nose gear airplane, it's an entirely different experience, and I think one that lots and lots and lots of our friends out there in YouTube land could benefit from.
I know I could.
Well, that's what we're going to do.
And that's what we did. Following this ground school session, we went up in Doug's Tailorcraft L2 to begin the flight portion of my tailwheel training, which we're also sharing here on YouTube. Doug and I look forward to seeing your comments to this video. As always, I appreciate your support of this channel by subscribing, by sharing this video with your friends, or through Patreon. From here, you can see how my L2 flight went by clicking on the top left image. To get to my flight school playlist with other training videos, like the excellent multi-engine training with Doug or my Lean of Peak course, click on the top right image. Thanks for watching, and see you soon in another video.